All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. It is good to see everybody. We're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, if you would like to be turning over there. Before we get into our time of study, Michael's got a song for us, and so we'll sing together, and then we'll get into our study.
I want to just start by telling you a few things I know. I know that my Redeemer lives and ever prays for me. I know eternal life he gives from sin and sorrow free. I know that unto sinful men his saving grace is nigh. And I know that he will come again to take me home on high. And I know that over yonder stands a place prepared for me, a home, a house not made with hands, most wonderful to see. I know that my Redeemer lives and ever prays for me. I know eternal life he gives from sin and sorrow free. I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life he gives. I know.
Thank you. That's right. That's right. Thank you, Michael, for that. Again, we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, chapters 1 through 5 tonight. I want to mention really quickly, next Saturday, the 17th, is our vacation Bible school from 10 to 2, and Michelle and Kim are kind of organizing some things for that. And if you would like to help out with the meal for the lunch on that Saturday, please get with either one of them and let them know. The other thing that they're looking for is the game Jenga, that stacking block thing where you pull it out and try not to make it all fall. If you have that at home, let them know so that they can have one of those for our time of VBS. So with all of that said, we've already gone through the Gospels of Matthew and Luke in our study, and in a couple of months we'll probably get into the Gospel of John, and so we'll have covered all of them this year. The Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels, and it's connected with Matthew and Luke. They're oftentimes called the Synoptic Gospels. There's a similarity between all three of these. A lot of the things are going to kind of cross over and overlap. But what Mark does a little bit differently is Mark hits the ground running. There's no build-up. It's just you're in the ministry of Jesus from basically verse 9 of chapter 1 throughout the rest of the book. Whereas you read Matthew and Luke, and you've got the prophecies, and you've got the births of John and the birth of Jesus, and you have all of these things that you're really not into Jesus' ministry until about chapter 3 or 4 or so. And so Mark hits the ground running, and so we're going to do that with this time together this evening as well. It's believed that the gentleman named John Mark that we read about in Acts is the author of the book of Mark, though again, much like the other Gospels, we really don't see anyone name themselves as the author. But if that's accurate, it's also believed that Peter would have been a great resource to Mark in particular with this. And so just a little background. But if you open up to chapter 1, we'll just kind of quickly walk through the 5 chapters, and then we'll come back and we'll dig in a little bit deeper. So as it opens the same way the other Gospels do, with the ministry of John the Baptist. And as Martel Pace brought up in his commentary, this is one of the only times we see Mark quoting Old Testament scripture like this. He does not do that near as often as the other gospel writers do. His audience is believed to be Roman Gentiles, and so that would have not necessarily been a big need for them to see necessarily in the gospel. But basically what he does is he lays out John's ministry, and then he gets right into the work of Jesus. And so you have the baptism of Jesus, the temptation of Jesus, and then off Jesus goes in miracles and beginning to call his disciples to him. And so you see that laid out really all the way through chapter 1, all of these different things that Jesus is doing in healing and preaching. And then you come into chapter 2, and you're going to see opposition to Jesus grow. You're going to see some of those things that the religious leaders in particular are going to try to do to stop the ministry of Jesus. Throughout all of these chapters, one of the things that Mark wants us to understand is that Jesus is calling really a lot of people to himself. That crowds are really coming to Jesus, and so he's really surrounded a lot. And in the midst of all of those people coming to Jesus, they're not all on his side, if you will. They're not all in favor of what he is doing. And so we see some of that opposition creep up in chapters 2 and 3. And then in chapter 4, you have one of the few sections that's really just focused in on Jesus' teaching. A lot of Mark is the miracles and some of the different situations that Jesus is in. But chapter 4 is a section on parables. And so most of the chapter deals with the parables that Jesus shares here. And I believe this might be about all of the ones that Jesus actually shares in Mark's gospel. And then you get to end of chapter 4 and all of chapter 5, and you go back to some of the big miracles of Jesus calming the storm, casting out the legion of demons, and then raising the dead girl back to life and healing a woman with a bleeding issue. And so again, when you look at these opening 5 chapters, you got a lot of miracles. You got a lot of Jesus doing ministry in that regard. And so I want to go back to chapter 1 with you, and I want to look at something in chapter 1, verses 35 through 39. If I ask you tonight to list out for me the priorities of your life, right? You could give me, right, 4, 5, 6 different things that you say these are really, really important. Right? These are really significant things. What happens when the order of the priorities gets out of whack? Just in the regular things of our lives. If you say, I've got my faith and I've got my work and I've got my family, or whatever your stuff is, right? What happens when those things maybe get out of order? Stress, some chaos, some frustration. And we've all been there, and we probably have seen it in people, right? When work becomes the biggest priority and other areas suffer, you can say, it's not, work's important, right? But you've got to make sure you take care of this or you take care of that. And probably for a lot of people, entertainment is a priority, right? And that could very easily take a precedent where that's the most important thing. And so other things get left to the side. When we talk about the ministry of Jesus, I bring this up because Jesus, when you think about the ministry of Jesus, was Jesus' ministry only one thing? No, he had different parts. Right? What are some of the different aspects of the ministry of Jesus? What are some of the different kinds of things that Jesus was doing?
Healing.
Okay, he would be healing people, right? That was a big part of this, Dave.
Teaching.
Okay, teaching, right? And not just what kind of teaching? What are the different ways that Jesus taught that were kind of a little different?
Multitudes.
Okay, he's got large crowds, right? We see some of that, right? Where people, massive groups, what we would think of as preaching, right? Where he's got a large audience. And then you've also got it where discipleship, right? Where you got smaller group settings. Go ahead, Rudy. Okay, and he taught in different ways, right? He didn't always just say the same things in the same fashion, but he taught in parables. So he taught sometimes in order to conceal, right? To kind of keep a message from some people. And other times he's taught very plainly. And so you've got teaching, you've got miracles, you've got healings, and then you've got miracles outside of that as well. And all of these things are working together, right? But when you walk through Mark's account, one of the things that becomes very obvious is the people of Jesus' day, they really wanted one thing to be the focus of Jesus' ministry, and that was healing. I mean, people wanted Jesus to heal, and it's continuous, right? You walk through and you see Jesus, and the crowds are coming, and they want him to do They wanted to change their lives. They wanted him to do these things. And the problem isn't that that was wrong, but the problem was, could Jesus have healed 24/7 and continued to heal 24/7 for the rest of his life? Yeah. Yeah. There's always something, right, that he could have been doing. And so if you look down at chapter 1, he's the section right above this, 29 through 34, he's healed many. And then in verse 35 it says this, "And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him, and they said to him, 'Everyone is looking for you.' And he said to them, 'Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out.' And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons." Right? So Jesus here gets away, and he spends some time in prayer, and the disciples didn't know where he was. They eventually find him. And based on what they say here, what are they kind of expecting Jesus' day should look like?
Definitely not solitude praying to the Father. That's something that shocked them, I think, and so they should be out doing the people stuff.
Right. I mean, Jesus, we've got crowds all over the place, right? They want to hear you. They want to listen to you. They want to have you heal them. And you're off by yourself. What maybe they didn't ask it, right? But what are you doing? And Jesus says very clearly, "Let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." He wasn't just going to spend all of his time in one place and say, "Hey, bring everybody to me and I'll heal them. That's my ministry." That was a part of it, but there was much more to it than that. He came with a message. Go ahead, Rudy.
Because it's like what you said, people mistook the whole thing. They thought he was healing more than anything else, so they were trying to take the opportunity of getting healed instead of listening to the word, and that was not what his purpose to begin with.
Yeah, and this goes back to, we talked about this recently at some point. I don't remember which the class we were in, but in John 6, where Jesus he feeds the 5,000, right? They're excited. But are they excited about what it means? No, they're excited about food, right? They kind of got off on what exactly was Jesus doing. Go ahead, Chuck.
I think that it brings up what was the purpose of the miracles to begin with. It wasn't just to heal somebody or to get rid of a demon. It was to confirm that he is the Christ. And once you've done that, you don't have to heal the entire community to make that point. You do it with, should be, you do it with one.
Sure.
But he'd done it with several. Let's get on to the next so that my word can be confirmed over here.
And we would like to be able to open up the gospel, right, and read that Jesus healed every disease and every person that had a problem in that day was healed. But the reality is Jesus heals in Capernaum, and he goes off to Nazareth. Is somebody going to get sick after he leaves Capernaum? Yeah. Somebody else is going to have. I mean, if that was the sole focus of Jesus' ministry, he could have continuously done that and never kept up, right, if he was healing one person at a time. And yet Jesus tells us very clearly, that's not the focus. Now, to your point, there was a reason for them. He wasn't just doing them to do them. He was doing the miracles for a purpose, and we'll see more of that later on in our reading. Go ahead, Mike.
It's a good illustration to us that it's the entirety of the work of the church that's important. If we dedicate ourselves, say, solely to benevolence and we fail in teaching, we fail. Or completely dedicated to singing, but we fail fellowship, that we fail.
Yeah, it's easy. Again, you think about, all these different things that matter, right? It's easy to kind of, well, this is the only one that matters. Well, no, right? And Jesus could have said, listen, my preaching is the only thing that matters, and so I'm not going to do anything. Well, no, the other stuff had a purpose, but it all fit in the mission that he was there to accomplish. And the same thing, as your point, Mike, is that we have a mission as well, and everything should feed into that. It should all kind of connect together and not get derailed on one of the things becomes the mission. Because again, Jesus' mission could have been healing all the time, but that wasn't the mission, and so he had to keep that in mind. I want to look down at verse 40. We're going to kind of walk through the first 3 chapters mainly tonight, but I want you to listen to what happens here. So he's left to go and preach, and the very next thing we have is a healing come up again, and it says, "And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand, and he touched him, and said to him, 'I will be clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean." Now, we've just seen Jesus is surrounded, right? I mean, there's crowds. If you go back and you read, there's crowds. The disciples are saying, you know, the crowds are looking for you. He's gone off to pray, and now he says, we're going to go somewhere else. What tends to happen to us as people when needs just continuously occur around us?
Burnout.
We get burned out. What is that? What happens when you get burned out with that? What do we tend to do? Go ahead, Rudy.
We get exhausted.
Yeah, we get tired. We get cranky, right? We get worn down, and eventually, maybe as kind of a coping mechanism, right? We kind of harden our hearts a little bit, right? And so for those of you that maybe have worked in areas where there's a lot of need, right? Maybe anybody who's worked in social services or any of those kinds of fields, at some point, maybe just to kind of just be able to deal with her, we kind of just enough is enough. You know, we hear the next story and we're like, it's another one. You know, we kind of grow hard to people's needs. And it would be very easy to look at Jesus and think, man, you know, he's just, everyone is constantly seeking him. And they don't seem to really have much concern for Jesus, right? Later on in chapter 3, we're going to see that so many people were coming that they weren't even able to eat because they were being continuously bombarded by people. And the amazing thing that Mark records for us here is that when this guy comes up and he says, if you will, you can make me clean, it says, moved with pity. Moved with pity, Jesus then goes on to heal this man. What does this help us understand about Jesus? Compassion, and real compassion, right? To have pity when at some point, even the softest of hearts, oftentimes we get inundated with so much hurt and so much pain and so much need that it's kind of hard to feel pity any longer, right? To have compassion. And yet Jesus absolutely did. Go ahead, Sheila.
Jesus has something that we don't. He can see inside your heart. So he knows if he's trying to be played for a fool.
Sure.
And, you know, I'll help anybody. But it really upsets me if I think I've been played.
Right. And that's one of those things where we always wrestle, right? With should I help, should I not help? And that makes even the needs around us even more frustrating at times. And for Jesus, you know, he's surrounded by people who have legitimate needs. He's surrounded by people who see him as a means to an end. He's surrounded by people who don't actually believe anything that he's saying. He's surrounded by people who want nothing more than to pick apart the things that he's saying to use against him. And in the middle of all of that, right, when you could just be like, you know what, humanity, I don't know why I did this. He says, I'm going to have compassion on this guy. And as we see there, he touches him, and he says, I will be clean, and immediately the leprosy left him. Right? The heart of Jesus, and by extension really the heart of God, is on display in little small snippets like these. Go ahead, Dave.
And then he touched a leper. I mean, think about that. The man probably hasn't been touched by a clean person for who knows how many years. And Jesus could have said, be healed. He touched him. So that shows another aspect of the compassion of Jesus.
Yeah, to actually do that, right? To touch someone who was untouchable, essentially, in society. He was willing to do that. And he brought about healing immediately for him. Go ahead, Mike.
I think it's a reflection on all the knowledge that he has as deity. But he's already decided from before creation that he's going to be the one to save humanity. He took that role. And it would be a negative reflection. You could start to doubt if he came to earth and started saying, oh, I've got second thoughts. But he never had second thoughts because he knew, being the all-knowing God, exactly what he was walking into. And still made that decision.
Yeah, all of that, right? All of the struggle, right, of what he was going to go through and experience. He was absolutely willing to do that, knowing, right, what he was going to experience. And he continued to have compassion. There was none of, you know, there's none, you don't get any picture from Jesus outside of when he's in the garden praying about what's about to take place. You get no impression from Jesus that, and even then, it's more of a desire not to go through that, but understanding the reality of it. But you don't get any picture of Jesus being like, oh, this is just, you know, I got to do it. I don't really want to do this, but I got to do it. No. Even then, right, in the midst of that, he is hurting in the midst of that. He still knows what is needed, but the pain of that is going to be tremendous, what he's going to experience. And yet throughout his ministry, you see Jesus continually, right, he's real. I mean, he really cares about humanity. Go ahead, Meg.
It's nice to be reminded of Jesus' humanity too, because it's just another way
Yeah, and what's interesting, right, when you think about if you were going to make up a story about essentially God in the flesh, wouldn't you make a story up of a guy who never slept and he didn't have to eat and he didn't have to do the regular things because he was something more, right? And yet the gospel writers want us to understand, well, Jesus was more than a man, and yet he was a man. He grew hungry and he grew tired, right? And we see in the calming of the storm, right? What's he doing? He's sleeping. He's sleeping because he did grow tired. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, maybe there's a little something to be seen with the order in which he does this. He forgives the sins of the man first, and then he poses a question to the scribes, about which is easier to forgive the sin or to get up and arise and walk. And either one of them is going to require a man of God and God's will for either one of them to happen.
Right.
But just like to your point, see, maybe not everybody was healed during that time. And so, another question that might be of consideration is not only which is easier, but which is more important.
Sure.
Because if he's a paralytic for all the rest of his life, that's one thing. But to not have his sins forgiven is another.
Right. Yeah. Okay, what is the priority? It's not the neglect of one, but it's considering what really matters. Dave, did you have something?
Quick question.
Yeah.
In some translations, the Common English Bible says he was incensed. The New International Version says he was indignant. But most of them show he's full of compassion. I don't get it. Is there some Greek thing there that can be translated a couple different ways? Or?
I'm trying to remember. We've been studying miracles on Monday nights, and one of the ones that we looked at one of the miracles. I don't remember what the reasoning was. I'll have to look that up and see, because I know one of the words that we looked at. It was with Lazarus, when Lazarus was healed, and Jesus was indignant, I think is what some translations say in that particular instance. But it seems like maybe there's a little confusion on some of those kinds of emotional responses from Jesus, some of the wording that I have to look into it in the specific verses to remember for sure. Go ahead, Cindy.
Just getting back on the compassion part, the fact that, he heals the leper is just great and wonderful, but that he touches him. Imagine the emotional need that the leper had to be touched. Not just the physical need, but emotionally, how healing had to begin for him emotionally with that. And
Yeah.
the love he must have felt from him and for him that he touched him.
Jesus is, again, there's a humanity to Jesus where he understands people, right? And what is needed here. I want to go to chapter 2, because Michael kind of headed us this direction, but one of my favorite miracles is in chapter 2 with this situation with the man that is paralyzed. And so you're probably familiar with it, but I want to read it really quickly, and then we'll just kind of dig in a little bit. It says, and when he returned to Capernaum, after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together so that there was no more room, not even at the door. And he was preaching the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise, take up your bed and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, rise, pick up your bed and go home." And he rose and immediately picked up his bed and went out before them all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." And so when you look at this situation, right, there's a whole lot that happens here. And you've got the friends that bring their paralyzed friend with them. You've got Jesus' response to them. You've got the religious leaders' response to Jesus. And you've got then Jesus' response back to the religious leaders. When you look at each of these kind of situations, what jumps out to you in this situation that is compelling. What about the friends, the religious leaders, or Jesus? What happens here that kind of jumps out to you? Go ahead, Gary.
I think if I was one of these guys that was thinking that, and then Jesus asked me, why am I thinking that, I would have been kind of amazed or scared.
Right. Yeah. Jesus, I mean, that's one of the things that we see this, right, when you go through the Gospels, is there are times where Jesus knows exactly what they're thinking, and he says it in a way that you know that he knows exactly what you're thinking, which is a little bit unsettling. Go ahead, Rudy.
And part of your question is that he came to do what he came to do, no matter whatever they said or how he was criticized.
Yeah.
He was going to get it done.
Now, this is one of those moments where when we think of Jesus, we think of nice Jesus, right, who doesn't stir the pot or cause any problems. And yet, in this particular instance, Jesus very easily could have made this a very easy situation, right? He could have simply done what he did with a lot of people and just said, hey, take up your mat and walk. Nobody would have probably said much of anything negative. And yet, in that moment, he says, no, I'm gonna do something else right now. I'm gonna poke the bear, right? It's kind of what he's going to do. I'm going to forgive this man of his sins, knowing exactly how they would have responded to that. And so Jesus does use this, not just to heal, but to actually teach something very, very important about himself. Go ahead, Chuck.
I'm always amazed at the determination of this guy's friends. They're going to climb up on top of the roof and cut a hole in a person's house.
Right.
And I've taken apart some things, and every time I do, there's lots of stuff falling down. And I'm thinking they're taking this roof apart, and the people down below are feeling dust and everything else dropping on them. Nothing's ever said about that. They're just determined to get him
Right.
down, and that had to have been a pretty good-sized hole.
Right. And I'm going to be honest with you guys. If you needed me to cut a hole in someone's roof for you, I'm going to be like, guys, I don't think this is a good idea. I'm a little uncomfortable with this, right? That would be me. I'd be like, maybe we'll catch Jesus tomorrow. That would be me, because I'm like, these guys apparently didn't have any concern with cutting that hole. Go ahead, Dave.
I think it's one of the earliest times, too, that Jesus confirms that he is God.
Yeah.
They're saying, who can forgive sins but God?
Yeah.
Well, Jesus can on earth. He had the authority. So, I mean, that connection there is, I think, one of the very boldest first statements. I'm God. I'm the great I am.
Yeah, it's a big deal what he does. And what is interesting about the way Jesus does this is, truthfully, I mean, anyone could declare themselves to be God, right? I mean that's words. Anybody could utter those words. Can you back it up, right? And that's essentially, Jesus makes this statement. And again, honestly, could anyone declare someone's sins forgiven? Yes. Now, not literally. I mean, you couldn't actually forgive their sins, but you could say the words. I mean, anybody could sit there and say, hey, your sins are forgiven, because nothing happens. I mean, nothing's visible, right, in what happens. And so Jesus, knowing that, right, he makes this statement that's really unverifiable. And then he says, but just because, you don't believe, I'm going to show you, though, that I really am able to do that by doing something else that no one else can do either. And so he's connecting a dot for them that, again, they're not necessarily wanting to see connected, but it's ultimately, this is the work of God, right? This is, if God is the only one that can forgive sins, and I'm doing other things that seemingly only God can do, well then, you draw the conclusion here, which was not the conclusion that they wanted to reach, but he is God. Go ahead, Meg.
I know that, I don't remember if this is before or after, if I'm getting it confused with the other Gospels, but at some point I know that the crowd had asked Jesus for a sign. And this is, like, he explicitly proved he was God by healing someone, and it was after saying something only God can do. And he backed it up with that. And he doesn't give people a sign when they ask for it, but he does over and over through different things like this specifically. Normally he would just heal because of someone's faith, but here it was okay, this is the sign. This is what you were waiting for. This is what I'm giving you. Here is proof
Right.
that I am who I say I am.
Yeah.
And people seemed amazed, but it didn't seem like so many people were there just for the healing, and they weren't necessarily like, oh yeah, sure, he's God,
Right. I mean, for Jesus, if you are looking, he gives you enough to connect the dots. If you're not, he's not going to give you the thing that you want so that you can then connect the dots. Like with the religious leaders, they wanted this continual, you mentioned, they were continually seeking signs. And we read that and we were like, what? More? You want more? I mean, what more do you want him to do? And yet it wasn't on his terms, it was on their terms. You do the thing that will confirm to us what it meets our criteria. And Jesus is saying, no, I'm doing all kinds of things that make clear who I am. You just don't want to see them. You just don't want to notice them for what they are. Go ahead, Sheila.
Jesus never backs down. He isn't mean. He's not boisterous. He's humble, but he's strong. And,
Yeah.
And you can't shake him.
Yeah, he knows who he is. He knows what he's come to do, and nobody's going to push him off of that, right? And so when you walk through this situation, you can imagine, somebody essentially saying they can do something God can do. It probably got quiet, I would guess. Maybe there's some serious thinking going on and maybe even some gasps, right? And yet Jesus doesn't back down from the situation. He makes very clear, no, this is exactly who I am and what I'm able to do. And so you look in this situation, and Jesus takes a very, again, for us it would be amazing, but for him, a pretty normal situation, right? He does miracles seemingly all the time in Mark. He takes this very normal situation, and he turns it into something to teach something truly abnormal about himself, which is that he truly is God. Go ahead, Rudy.
And adding more into that was that a lot of the repentant people really didn't know who he was, because they mentioned Jesus, Son of God.
Yeah.
Can you help me? Can you save me? Can you do this? So a lot of people didn't know that he was the Son of God, and they felt it. But obviously the scribes and the Pharisees, God already knew their heart that they weren't even close to what they used to do yet.
Well, and you look at, again, we're not there yet in Mark, but you look at the Gospels where Peter and the other apostles confess who Jesus is. Clearly people were starting to figure out a little bit about what's going on, but not everybody. Not everybody. And it leads into the next section here, verses 13 through 17. And so I want to read that quickly. It says, he went out again beside the sea, and all the crowds were coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And from this little section, right, we oftentimes probably hear about the need to be around people who are in need, right? That Jesus didn't spend his time, Jesus didn't come into the world and then say, hey, I need all of the religious, righteous people. I need to kind of have you be a bubble around me so I don't, get stained by the world, by the people who are the sinners of the day, if you will. And here we find him right in the middle of them, right? He's at the home of Levi, or Matthew, as he's known otherwise, and he's surrounded by these people, and that leads to some opposition from the religious leaders because, wait a second, this is kind of a guilt by association, right? Well, Jesus is hanging around all of these sinful people. Why would he do that, right? Their teachers wouldn't do that, so Jesus here is doing that. When he says this, though, we get the part where he says, I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. We get that part of it in regards to the sinners, but when he says righteous here, what do you think he means by that? Is Jesus saying, hey, I didn't come because there are some people who don't need me?
There's none righteous except God alone, but they're religious. They're proud. They're arrogant because they think they're religious enough.
When you look at the Gospels and you walk through several situations with Jesus, one of the things that he does is at times he points out the blindness of people to their own flaws and their own faults.
You just might put the word self in front of that.
Yeah.
Would probably be accurate.
Yeah. And so when Jesus says this, right, he's drawing out he's not saying, hey, you guys are good. He's just saying, no, I'm really coming for those that recognize that they have a need. I came for those who are sick. And that makes sense, right? Why is he not just hanging around the religious elite of the day? Well, because there are people who need him. And the ones that realize it are typically, though not always, but typically those who are the outcast, the sinner, if you will, of the day. Go ahead, Mike.
When you look at it from that perspective, that there was no person on this earth that wouldn't have been called
Yeah, and when you think about this, right? Again, you walk through the Gospels, the people who are searching to understand who Jesus is, they find out who Jesus is. There's no wall there that he puts up and he says, nope, I know you're searching. I know you have a desire to find out who I am, but I'm not gonna, no. That's not how it works. I mean, that's the parables, right, are designed for those very people, that they would get it, while people who really aren't interested in truly understanding him wouldn't get it. They'd say, that's a dumb story. Doesn't make any sense, right? One of the things that I thought about with kind of connecting to our own time is one of the worst positions to be in is to be sick and not know it, right? One of the worst positions that we can be in is to be sick and not realize it. And there are countless people, right, every year who die because they were sick and they didn't know it, right? Because they had clogged arteries and they didn't realize their arteries were clogged until they had a heart attack, if I got the wording right on that, and they died, right? They were sick and they didn't know it. Or you fill in the blank with all kinds of other things. Spiritually speaking, right, it's even worse when you're spiritually sick and you don't realize it. And that's essentially where the religious leaders were at, because if you think you're just fine with God and somebody's telling you you need to get right with God, what are you going to say? I'm good. I'm already there, right? I don't need what you're offering. And that's essentially what we want to avoid, right? Is we want to avoid being those who don't recognize that we do have a need, that we are the ones who Jesus did come for, that we do have a need for him. Go ahead, Mike.
And we're all terminals. There's no degrees. Every single one of us is sin. Every one of us is deserving of death and punishment. It's all eternal.
When we get together on Sunday, we're going to talk about Romans 5, and we're going to dig into the first 11 verses there. And when you look at that, we oftentimes like to talk about, we talked about this a little bit with the last series, but, you know, the way God values us, right, our significance to God. But Romans 5 doesn't point that out so much as it points out the sinfulness, the absolute sinfulness that we have within us, right? And that's, we have to recognize that we are, you know, as Paul would say, he was the chief of all sin. I mean, that's the attitude, right? That we're meant to have, not to say, woe is me, I'm this horrible person that's unredeemable, but instead to recognize just how much we need Jesus. Because when you recognize you need Jesus, then something happens. It's when we fail to recognize that, or we fail to appreciate just how much we need him, that we run into a lot of problems. And for the religious leaders of Jesus' day, that was a great struggle for them, to recognize that they were just as needing Jesus as those sinners were in that room surrounding Jesus, right? They didn't see that the same way. Go ahead, Michael.
And that in 1 Corinthians 6, you know, that's where Paul talks about a list of evil deeds or the kinds of evil deeds that people used to do. That really just sort of seems to really support what's going on here with what Jesus is saying, is that people do with me, they have an opportunity to change their lives.
Yeah.
And that's what Paul is saying when he runs down that list of people and says in there that such were some of you.
Right.
You were these type of people with these unrighteous and evil deeds, and you changed.
Yeah, and that's where when we go through life, right, it's easy to say, oh man, you know how horrible, and you start listing all the stuff, right? And then Paul says, and maybe they started reading that, and they're like, yeah, those horrible people. And he's like, and you, remember, that was you. You were those kinds of people, and you were changed by Jesus. And so it gives hope to everyone that there can be change through Christ. And again, unfortunately, as we walk through the Gospels, we see that was not always the response, and probably more often than not wasn't the response from people. Go ahead, Brianna.
I think the sad thing is that sometimes when we do change and then we are close with God and we surround ourselves with others who are of the same mindset, we do kind of forget that we were that way. And then we kind of look, and then our human sinful selves, we look down on them, and like it was mentioned, we were that. And I think it's always hard for us in this world where we have pride and sin and everything to remember that we were just like them. Maybe we didn't have the same sins. Maybe we were different with that. But like we've been saying, we all were terminally ill and terminally sick, and we were all going to go down that same road. We just saw Jesus before that person. That doesn't make us better.
Right.
We just have to help them see too.
Yeah, and one of the struggles that we can very easily find ourselves having is the longer from when we became a Christian and the further we get from that time frame, the easier it is to kind of think, yes, Jesus, but, I've done a lot too, right? I've grown so much, and it's the same kind of idea where someone who at one time maybe didn't have much money and now they're wealthy looks at someone else who doesn't have, and they say, well, hey, listen, I did it, right? If you just do what it's easy to look down on someone else that was in the past that you had, and say, well, if you really, if you were trying, you'd figure this out or whatever. And that's the same thing that can happen spiritually, is we can look at people and say, I can't believe they're struggling with that. I can't believe someone would do that. It's easy to forget. It's easy to forget where we came from and what was done for us. Now, we are expected to change our lives and live according to him, but the real heavy lifting is done by Jesus, and we're not supposed to ever forget that. Go ahead, Reed.
But I want us to take into consideration also that, God is looking at us, what we're doing.
Yeah.
And if we're doing good, I'm sure he's going to take that for account. We're not following to go to heaven in vain. There is a reward, and God takes that for account, just as long as we don't fail at it.
Yeah, God wants us to live for him, and he wants us to continue in his ways and to grow and all of those things. We want to be able to say that we are more mature and we are closer to him than we were in the beginning. And God is aware of all of that. He wants us to choose his ways, and that's part of this process of growth, but it has to begin somewhere, right? It has to begin with a decision that I need Jesus. And for some of the people of Jesus' day, including Matthew here, they recognize that. And for others, especially here specifically, some of the scribes, they didn't. And so when you look through the rest of our section, one of the things that pops up again is you've got this opposition that begins to build against Jesus. And when we look at the religious leaders, it's obviously really easy to kind of point and say, how horrible they were and how wrong they were. And they were wrong. I mean, they absolutely were wrong. But if you don't believe that Jesus is who he's claiming to be, and you believe he is deceiving people, you'd be doing what they're doing. I mean, they're doing what makes sense to do. If Jesus is a fake Messiah, another one of those who's claiming something that's not true, you're going to do this stuff, right? And so we've already seen, just in the couple of chapters that we've looked at, right, one of the things that they don't say it out loud, but he knows what they're saying, is he's a blasphemer, right? They're going to dismiss some of what he's doing by calling him a blasphemer. Here they're going to dismiss or try to oppose him by saying, well, he's around the wrong people. Clearly, if he was who he claims to be, he wouldn't be around those people. If you go over into chapter 3, let's see, verse 23 of chapter 2, the disciples and Jesus are walking along, and the disciples begin to pluck some of the heads of grain and begin to eat that. And they call him out for violating the law. You're breaking God's law. Now, Jesus wasn't. He was breaking their laws that they had based on God's law. And so they do that, right? If you're going to say, well, this guy, he's not really the one who's claiming to be, well, showing how he breaks the law would be a good way to do that. And then one of the last ones, and this is one that gets Jesus' ire up the most, and we'll just read it quickly. Verse 22 of chapter 3. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out demons. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Truly, I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness and is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying he has an unclean spirit. Right? And so they even go as far to essentially claim the very work of God is the work of the devil. Right? The very things that Jesus is doing, empowered by the Holy Spirit, in fact, they claim they're actually from Satan. It's Satan doing something to deceive people. And Jesus says, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would Satan cast himself out of people? Why would he do this? It doesn't make any sense. And so he very, very strongly opposes this particular line of thinking that they give him. I want to mention one more thing, and then we'll close out with our prayer time. So one of the interesting things that comes up here in Mark's account in chapter 3, if you look up at verse 20, it says, and he went home, and the crowd gathered again so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying he is out of his mind. Now, does anybody else have a different word than family right there?
Own people.
His own people. I didn't know this. There's some debate on who this is talking about. Is it his family, or is it people who knew him closely, friends, or people who were from his town? There was debate on that. I think it's his family, because it makes sense that they're coming for him. And then later on in the chapter, we see them come to him. Verse 31, and his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. Now, it's a very, very odd situation, right? The Bible clearly holds family in high regard. We see that in multiple passages. And we, by extension, right, hold family in high regard. And yet Jesus here holds something else in higher regard. He says, who is my family? Essentially, my family are those who are doing the will of God. And so he's shifting the focus, right? And we see this is how valuable God considers his people, right? His people are family. Jesus considered those who were doing the will of God his family. And so kind of an interesting thing that Mark highlights for us here about some opposition that Jesus faced, not only from those who were against his work altogether, but those who were thinking he's crazy, basically, because all these people are coming. He's not even eating because there's so many people. This is just madness. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, and if that's how Jesus looks at his people, it really does challenge us to look at our spiritual family in a way that's stronger than we many times look at it. It's not just, oh, we're fellow members. We're more than that.
Yeah, we're not just all people who signed up for the same club or the same group, right? There is supposed to be something that is even thicker than blood, if you will, right? I mean, there's more to this relationship that we're called to have than just, we believe the same thing. No, we're bound together in a very unique way.
Respect for eternity. We better learn to like each other.
Yes. There are lots of reasons, right, to get along. One of them is you will spend eternity with all of these people. That's a good reason to get along as well. All right, so starting today and through next Tuesday, we're going to be going through Mark 6 through 10. And so we'll kind of cover the middle section there of the Gospel of Mark. For those watching online, appreciate you joining us. We will move into our wrap-up time of prayer.